Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'll just echo, too, that I'm going to be talking about another scale, which is regional in nature. And I'm actually going to be talking about a project that I was part of from 2012 to 2018. It was looking at regional food systems. I'm going to go ahead and the overall goal of this project, this is our kind of official goal that we put on the proposal, but it was really to understand what's the role of regional in food systems. And I was one of 22 researchers on this project. We represented 16 disciplines. I cannot even begin to tell you how difficult it was to work with 16 disciplines on a project. We actually developed a glossary to even understand what the other people were saying. I mean, it was, and I kid you not, I headed up the consumption group. There was a head of a distribution group from Cornell, Miguel Gomez, and Tim Griffin from Tufts headed up the production group. And then we had a modeling group, which was also cross-disciplinary, and that was headed by Chris Peters at Tufts as well. We had 9 locations. I'm going to go ahead and show you the map. 9 locations. In 5 of those were urban, 4 were rural, and each of those locations usually had 2 supermarkets as their kind of core site. And we used the supermarkets to study the supply chains that were going in and out of lower income neighborhoods. And that was sort of our reference point for understanding what was happening. So what I'm going to do today is tell you about some focus groups that we did that looked at regional, trying to capture ideas of how people conceived of regions and how they thought about regional food. And then I'm going to take on the task of explaining my colleagues' research, because I think I learned so much on this project. It was absolutely fascinating. And the 2 key points I want you to kind of walk away with is the importance of sort of, we are all kind of bound by our political geographies in many ways in our work, but the importance of understanding the different scales of that work is going on that we're surrounded by, I think, is one key takeaway. And then the other piece of that is the interdisciplinary nature of public health work, and certainly for us in food systems. We would have a very different understanding if I came at this work just with the public health lens, so it's been really important for me, and it was a huge learning experience to be part of this 7-year project with this team of researchers. 2 of the researchers on our team wrote a paper called It Takes a Region about 10 years ago. That paper is being updated and will be re-released in 2020. And in that paper, they defined 4 different dimensions that, of food systems that they look at from a regional perspective. The first one is food supply. Most of our food is coming from national and global supply chains. We get very little, really, from regional, proportionally speaking, but we don't often know that because we don't measure it very often. And we get even less from local supply chains. But we hear a lot about local food, so there's like a disproportionate attention being paid to local, but really very little understanding what's happening with regional. Resource management, natural resource management, really does need to be considered at a regional level, but oftentimes, again, is sort of bound by our political geographies. But things like land and water, energy, and marine life could all be better managed at a regional level. Economic development, for people who have done any sort of economic development in food systems or in any sector, probably would know that you need to pay attention to what's happening outside of your area and figure out if you're not creating structures and businesses that are not needed if there's going to be competition nearby. And then diversity, from not only a perspective of crop diversity, but also populations, diverse populations, and that can really garner a lot of resilience. So I'm going to talk about this focus groups right now that we did. And the goal of this was to really understand how do people perceive of regions and regionally produced food. This label is actually from Trader Joe's. I'm fascinated. The supermarket industry has already started to tag foods, label them as regional. I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, I don't know if anyone pays attention. They can't really get away with saying it's local, but they can say it's regional. I don't know how consumers really construct that in their heads, but this is definitely something that we're seeing happen. So we did 6 focus groups in our we did 8 focus groups in 6 of our communities, and we asked them, when we say to you, what region are you from? What do you say? And regions are very nested within one another. So we do see regions. This is a region, the Philadelphia region. It's multiple counties. You also have people talking about it from multiple states, like contiguous states. And bioregions are another big construction. And then the region that we were actually talking about was the Northeast. And so people mentioned all these different scales is how they identify with the region. We asked them about their perceptions of benefits and drawbacks about regional food, and much of this was conflated in the way that you would think about local food as well. So I'm not sure that we really got to the distinction if they were really thinking about it from a regional perspective or if they were really thinking about it locally. But that whole thing of circulating economy, the dollars that are spent in your area are also going to be benefiting your area. There's this notion that food that's produced locally and regionally is going to taste better, have better nutrients, and stay fresher longer. That can be debated on a number of scales, but that was their perceptions. The other perceptions, when we looked at variety and availability, people talked about the limited growing season and sort of in half in jest would say Florida's in our region because, of course, they wanted foods that were grown in Florida. So there's some desirability there. They also had an appreciation for the types of foods they'd be getting from the global supply chain. So they were not limited to thinking. They knew that they couldn't just rely on anything that was grown in the region. A few people, not a lot, mentioned resiliency concerns. So one of the factors that we see happening is that farmland, some of the best farmland is in peri-urban areas, and that is quickly getting gobbled up for development. And people would talk about the fact that if they were supporting regional producers, that there was it was likely that they would stay in production and that land would not get lost. And they also talked about in terms of fuel costs and transportation, and then issues around weather fluctuations. If there's a weather crisis in one state, that doesn't mean the other state's going to have that, and so maybe that state could supply food. Price is perhaps one of the biggest drivers for most households in determining what they're going to buy. And so, but there's a lot of, people have very different experience with direct marketing, and people would talk about farmers markets being more expensive than supermarkets, so they didn't like to go to the farmers markets, or it was cheaper, and so they would go to the farmers market instead of the supermarket. And so there's a lot of confusion about that, and I don't think that the idea of that building upon a region from that perspective really resonated very much. There was a recognition that, of course, when you aren't in these global supply chains, you're going to have additional costs because you don't get the same economies of scale. And we did 2 immigrant focus groups. These were first-generation immigrants, and then 2 rural ones, and we had some very interesting findings. So from the immigrant ones, when we asked them, where would you prefer to get your food from, they had a much larger geography that they were willing to accept as their kind of food shed than urban residents, which we thought was pretty interesting. They were much more like, we just want it from 100 miles. The immigrants were like, no, we could, much broader, 400, 500 miles. They had a stronger connection, agrarian connection. A lot of them had been producers in their own countries, and they oftentimes frequented farmers markets in those countries. They really appreciated the food culture and the ability to buy foods that were from their country or that were native to their country in where they were living now. And they were very cognizant of the fact that the producers in their country were providing foods to the global supply chain and that they needed that as a marketplace. And so they talked about it from a pretty sophisticated perspective in terms of how we're all connected. The rural focus groups also had this larger preference for where food was grown, and they were more likely to indicate a preference for regional over local sourcing. And we were in the Delmarva Peninsula for a couple of these, which is one of the largest chicken-producing regions, probably most of you know. And so they talked about having marketplaces for products that wouldn't necessarily sell in the United States. We're not eating a lot of chicken feet, but in the Asian markets, those are much more popular. And so that what did provide them this other resource for their products. So I'm going to transition now and talk about some of my colleagues' research and just give you some, why we do this interdisciplinary work. So this, what you're looking at right here is a graph that Tim Griffin and his team did. And basically what it's looking at is the capacity of the Northeast region. And so the Northeast is everywhere from Maine down to West Virginia, includes DC, does not include Virginia. And it looks at if we were going to get the capacity of our region to produce 76% of the milk that we drink, it's feasible for us to get 76% of the milk that we're using in this region from the region. This is animal products. 71% is eggs, and then you can kind of see it dropping down from shellfish, less and less when you get into the beef products. When you look over into the plant products, we are relying a lot on other regions for our plant-based foods. 26% we're capable of producing 26% of our vegetables in this region, so we are having to get a significant percentage outside of it and only 18% of the fruit. This is Dave Fletcher's work from USDA, and Dave is a climate modeler. So a lot of climate issues are going to be needed to be dealt with at a regional level. We are seeing, talk to any producer out there, they're seeing big fluctuations in weather and water, and that is going to have an influence over what they can grow. And so Dave modeled potato growing in the Northeast region. I'm not going to explain the numbers, I didn't do the math, but enough to suffice to say that he did this really interesting analysis that said if farmers are adapting, like say major adaptations, what could they grow versus no adaptation. So he did this continuum of adaptations, and then he looked at different scenarios around rainfall and temperature increase. And what he's finding is that obviously we're going to be growing potatoes in regions we are not currently growing them. But we need to help producers plan for this because this is something that is already happening to them, and they are not necessarily aware of how they need to be doing that. Chris Park and Miguel Gomez did the supply chain analysis at the stores. And so if you look on the left-hand side, so I said we had stores, supermarkets that we were tracing this through. In our focal stores, 78% of the apples being sold in those stores were grown in the Northeast region. 36% in cabbage, just goes down the line. None of the broccoli, all the frozen broccoli in the U.S. being sold is grown somewhere else. However, when you look at the economic activity that happens past the farm gate, we're actually capturing a lot of that economic activity. So there's the agricultural economy piece of it is really important. So 42% is going to be processing, packaging, and retail. And we capture 42% of that within the Northeast region. 44% from cabbage, 55% from potatoes, and 67% from broccoli. So that's pretty significant economic activity, but isn't necessarily, thought of as a way to build the economy, your agricultural economy. The last slide I'm going to talk about, and this gets into the continuum sort of rural and going down from the rural area down into a core urban. So Houman Sabiri from Columbia University is a planner, and he did an analysis of looking at how land is being used and what sort of economic activity is going on around this land. So this is Baltimore. The black area is the city core, so our city boundaries of Baltimore. And what he looked at, and then as you go further out, he defined it by looking at zoning, commuting, and population density. And so you see it as you spread out, clearly that means it's going to be less populated, but you still have a lot of economic activity going on. I'm going to show you what the different, there's production, processing, storage, wholesale, and retail are the sectors. So each of those dots represents some type of activity around the food system. And what he found is that oftentimes there's no one really paying attention to the type of these businesses and what's going on. And food, in many ways, I think food is fairly new still to thinking about it as a public sector, something we need to pay attention to in the public sector. Not a lot of people are not necessarily convinced it should be the public sector, but there's a lot of activity that's happening, and people know what's happened when you don't plan for that. So I think it's being ignored in large part by municipalities and also even at the state level because people don't know what's happening in these areas. So his goal is really walking away from this is saying that we need to really be planning for this because we're losing some of these industries. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. Not surprisingly, production is mostly happening in the rural areas. And then it gets in, but even 5% in Baltimore City, we have about 15 urban farms in Baltimore City. And so about 5% of the land in Baltimore City, or 5% of the production is happening in urban areas. And that goes, you can look through from processing, storage, retail. Again, this is sort of the very tiny slice of food retail happens in the rural areas. And then it gets much bigger in the urban areas. So just to give you an idea. So I'm going to stop with that and just talk about some of what I think are opportunities for the food systems is just thinking about we need to consider and bring in people to help us understand some of this agricultural economies that we can't really do that on our own as public health professionals. We need to start thinking more regionally and start to act more regionally, and that means reaching out and working with different sectors and with partners that we maybe are not used to working with. I think there is a role. Consumers are very aware, I don't care what their income level is, about the benefits of local food and why people should buy local food, but that doesn't really translate very easily into regional, and there's a lot of opportunities to build on that there. The Pompeian oil is actually produced in Baltimore City. This is their national headquarters, so I thought this would be a great example of that. Investment in infrastructure really needs to be done at a regional level, and that requires working outside of our comfort zone sometimes. And then one thought of just opportunity is there's a lot of procurement going on at institutions, government institutions, private institutions, hospitals, and there should be some ability to preference regional products within those institutions through contracting mechanisms. So I think it's less likely to happen maybe at the consumer level right now, more likely to happen at a procurement level. And that's it for me. Thanks.